in general, it's changed over the 5 years, so we are building momentum. My activism, the activism of other people have are beginning to change that, but still society doesn't recognise male victims because men do not present as ideal victims. So many barriers.
For those that don't know, this is Dr. Maz Idriss.
Dr. Heinz, thank you very much. Yes, my name's Dr. Maz Idriss. I'm a senior lecturer in law at Manchester Metropolitan University, based in the United Kingdom. I've been working there for about 7 years now. My academic career has spanned around 20 years or so. I'm an expert in law, and more specifically, I'm an expert in domestic abuse, honour-based abuse, forced marriages, both in the general population, but also specifically in minority groups as well. I've been researching that for the past 17 years. My PhD specifically was on female victims of honour-based abuse and forced marriages. And more recently, after the completion of my PhD, I began to study male victims of honour-based abuse and forced marriages as a under-researched topic.
We're going to dive more into the male abuse and what you just raised, which was how under-research it actually is. But what was the inspiration for transitioning over from researching regarding female victims to male victims?
Yeah, so quite an interesting story, I think. I first encountered honour-based abuse, or so-called honour-based abuse, and so-called honour killings, around 2005. So I was researching something really boring and mundane, like constitutional reform, and it was the House of Lords reform in particular. I used to teach constitutional law as well, and one of my colleagues had published an article in the journal, and he didn't give me a copy of it. So and go to the journal itself and get a copy of it. Back then, it was only available in paper format. So I opened the journal. It was a large, thick book, and I found the article that I wanted, but following the article before really caught my eye. It was called "Honor Killings in Pakistan."
Oh, okay.
I was like, "What's that?" Because my parents originally from Pakistan. I thought this is really interesting, so I photocopied that constitutional reform article and also that honour killings in Pakistan article, and I was reading it, and he said honour killings in Pakistan. This is a form of violence against women and girls. Women are killed in the name of honour, and Islam permits it. Or supposedly people use Islam as a justification. They don't. So it doesn't permit it. It goes against the Islamic faith, but people use religion to justify.
Yeah.
If we fast forward about 5-6 years after, then I published a book called "Honor Violence, Women in Islam," which had that specific goal, and the JP are trying to say Islam doesn't permit it.
Yeah.
But if you look at honour-based abuse and so-called honour killings, it exists across the world.
Yeah.
Regardless of culture, religion, ethnicity, race. When I was researching in 2005 that article, it really sparked my interest. So I began to read more about it, and Professor Lynn Welch and Sarah Hussain also published a book in 2005 called "Honour Crimes and Paradigms of Violence Against Women." That was an edited collection, and I read that, and it really captivated me. I said, wow, this is such an interesting area. And then that led to me working on the project Honour Violence, Women in Islam, which began around 2007. And really began to take momentum 2008, 2009, and then we published it eventually in 2010 in the end. And I got my doctorate about 5-6 years ago. So here I am today as an expert, which, it's really interesting because when you first start out, you think, no, you're not going to be an expert.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, people like yourself start approaching you and say, well, can you give us a bit of a commentary about this, and what's your views, and expert opinion as an academic on this. Going on to male victims very briefly. Once I finished my PhD, I was like, you experience a whole range of emotions. Like, you're really angry about it. These are the accounts of women. These are the accounts of stakeholders. It's like, what is going on? Really need to up the protection and legal regime and support available for victims. But at the same time, I was also very mindful that I'm a South Asian Muslim male. And I said to myself, well, if I was a victim, and I've never been a victim, but if I was a victim, what support mechanisms would there be available to me? So, I look to my right, to my left, forward, backwards, and there's a lack of support mechanisms available for me.
You mentioned honor-based violence. I don't think people, in my opinion, I don't think people are actually aware what that could mean. So what is meant in a societal definition of honor-based violence, and as well as academic,
Yeah. So I try
what is
to
meant
keep
by that?
it as simple as possible, but essentially, you've got domestic abuse, and there's a form of coercive control and behaviour, often by a perpetrator over a victim, and the person has their own reasons why they might be committing such domestic abuse. It might be control. It might often be about power, etc. And quite simply, that people might are just generally nasty and evil by their nature. I think honor-based abuse has a different kind of motivation.
Mhm.
Of course, there is something known as honor-based domestic abuse.
Okay.
Honor-based abuse might have an added motivation where a family wants to reclaim so-called honor and reputation that they believe has been tarnished because of the actions of a particular individual. So in some very traditional communities and families, there might be the situation where a girl, this is quite often very much linked to sexuality and a woman's sexual behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But a classic archetypal example might be a woman who has been discovered to have a boyfriend, and that's not the cultural norm within that community, society. And so if that gets out, then she's brought shame and embarrassment on the family.
Yeah.
So in order to stop her from, as it were, quote unquote, misbehaving, they then seek to control her, as it were, and her movements, and her, basically their sexual autonomy. And there's a whole range of actions that can lead to abuse and violence. So there could be, for example, minor condemnation, disapproval.
Yeah.
That's the low end. And then it can gradually get really worse. So it could be things like restriction of movement, being pulled out of college or university, mobile phones taken, passports taken, physically being beaten, stalked, followed, harassed, intimidated online. And in the worst case scenario, women have been killed in so-called honor killings. Yeah. Now, we call it so-called because within the academic sphere, there is no justification. I'm sorry. There can absolutely be no justification for killing anybody. And often when we talk about so-called honor killings, it's often from the lens of the perpetrator. And there is no honor in honor killings or so-called honor-based abuse. But it's a title, it's a definition which victims, stakeholders, and the general public can kind of understand. So we don't approve of it, as it were, but we use the term so-called honor-based abuse because people are very familiar with it. And I suppose one of the dangers of honor-based abuse is that we never really know what the risks are.
Yeah.
Because it will vary from one family to another, from one community to another. And that's what makes honor-based abuse so difficult to predict.
I did not realize this when my ex told me what happened to her when she lost her virginity.
Yeah.
And she was in a very traditional home, but she had her head shaven, like,
as a matter of respect.
Yeah, like But when she explained that to me, it was so out there because in my culture, that's not really what would happen. It would be more of they're gonna try and find the person that did it and set up a marriage. You know what I'm trying to say? So it wouldn't be so exactly what you said. It's so different in different communities that it's actually very hard to track and pinpoint what to actually do.
Absolutely. And you mentioned another point. So she had a head shaven as a mark of disrespect.
Yeah.
That's just awful.
Yeah.
But even in without trying to criticize your culture,
it wasn't my culture. It was her. It was hers.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah.
The other issue is that you try to find the man who she had sexual relations with, and then get them married. That's a forced marriage.
Yeah.
They don't want to get married. Things happen when you're young.
Yeah.
People do make mistakes, or in this instance, it might not even be a mistake. It could be a general relationship thing, and yet they just realise that it was a heat of the moment. There was a heat of passion between the two.
Yeah.
But ideal or suited, and yet you go and force them to marry. There's two victims there now as well.
Yeah.
So,
You're creating more victims from a victimized situation. Yeah. What is forced marriage, and how is it distinct from an arranged marriage, so to speak?
yeah, there's lots of links between honor-based abuse and forced marriage.
Okay.
So I always say to my students and other people I have conversations with, not every honor-based abuse case will involve forced marriage, because there's also all sorts of reasons why a person might experience honor-based abuse. But most cases, I believe, in forced marriages will have elements of honor. What's the difference between a forced marriage and an arranged marriage? Well, it's very simple. There's nothing wrong in principle with an arranged marriage, but there's everything wrong with a forced marriage. So let's interrogate that just a little bit more. So a forced marriage is where there's an absence of consent by one or both parties. And that's very important, because if there is no consent from either party or both parties, they shouldn't be forced to marry, because it's such a big responsibility being married, because it's a life-changing experience, because you're going to have sexual relationships with your partner, you're going to have children, you're going to be living with the person for the rest of your life, hopefully, if that was a good marriage, as it were. But to then be forced in a marriage, where you're gonna have those expectations. Imagine being forced to sleep with somebody that you don't love. You have no relationship.
Yes, exactly, and exactly, and there is also the extra layer of spiritual abuse as well, because you're making an oath to the God that you believe, and then you're like, well, I didn't want to do it, but if I leave now, I could be punished, or things like that. It destroys you mentally.
Exactly. Well, I have great sympathy for those who are forced into marriage, because it is a serious human rights violation. No one should be forced into marriage in this day and age, but unfortunately, it's a practice that does exist across the world. What's the difference between that and arranged marriage? Well, arranged marriage is really a cultural phenomenon where parents might become involved and assist in finding a suitable marriage partner for their child or children. And in principle, there's nothing wrong with that, so long as the child concerned, or the person concerned, shall I say, is an adult under English law. So there's a new legislation that's been passed in England that states that the minimum age requirement for marriage is 18 years of age. So if used to be 16, but that is no longer the case. You have to be 18 years old or older to consent. Otherwise, it's a void marriage. That's statutory legislation. So long as the person concerned, who is an adult, aged 18 or over, consents to their parents being involved in the finding of a suitable marriage partner, arranged marriages are perfectly fine, so long as the adult person consents. They could find potentially 4 or 5 partners and say, which one do you like? You choose which one you want, and it's up to the person to agree. And once they agree, then that's it. The parents negotiate with the other side's family, often having dinners and meetings, and then make the final arrangements, and bang, it's a wedding. And then that's fine. But there is obviously a slippage between arranged marriage and forced marriage. It's what I call the grey area. Now, forced marriages are wrong and illegal in this country because there's absence of consent. Arranged marriages are okay so long as the adult person, consents to the partner who their parents have found. But there is a middle grey area which can borderline forced marriage. So I give this another example to my students who say, I say this to them, I say, what happens if a parent gives an option of 4 men to their daughter and say, here are 4 suitable candidates for you. Choose any one of them. Now, on the face of it, that appears to be choice, but the choice is only limited to 4. So when does an arranged marriage become a forced marriage?
Okay.
I suppose in that kind of theoretical example, is there a limited choice? Why not a 5th person? Why not somebody else? What happens if all those 4 people are unsuitable? Does the person then feel, coerced and forced to pick one of them because the parents said you got to choose one of them?
Yeah.
So that's the kind of example where I would say I am skeptical, while I'll have some concerns about an arranged marriage. For me, if the girl or the boy has the choice to say no to all 4 and say, find somebody else, that's good. But if the choice is limited to only those 4 people,
And it's like you can't choose anyone else, it's just his fault.
I'm not happy with that.
Yeah, I can see why a scenario like that may arise. Like, for example, if those 4 gentlemen were from, let's say, a very rich family, and they're like, well, there's no other rich family that we can go to, so do this for us, you know. Now that we've kind of established that, I wanna bring this element in, and I think I'm not sure if it falls into the realm of honor-based violence, domestic violence. I'm not sure if it falls into that. But imagine a scenario in which the person is getting abused, and they feel like if they were to marry this person, that the abuse would end and it would work out for the best because they have now got that extra commitment, so to speak, you know.
Yeah.
How does that speak in the area of a forced marriage?
So I've come across a couple of examples like that in my research and with speaking to victims, and what you say kind of really resonates with a male victim that I encountered. A brilliant guy, such a humble guy. So basically, he came home from college one day, and his parents said, "Look, it's time for you to get married." And he goes, "What the hell? I don't want to get married." And it was somebody from Pakistan, basically. So it was a person that he didn't really know and didn't really identify with. And he was quite resistant. And then his parents became ill. His father particularly became ill and was hospitalized. And, he was in hospital, and family came over to see him, etc. And people were putting pressure on the guy and saying, this is what you're doing to your dad. Why don't you just listen to him? And so he caved in and he got married to her. And what you say kind of resonates because he did that for the sake of his father, for the sake of the family honor. Mm-hmm. And it's a form of coercion, blackmail, emotional blackmail. It's an example of coercive control as well. Mm-hmm. So that does resonate to me about domestic abuse, honor-based abuse, and ultimately a forced marriage because he doesn't really consent. And so what happened was they got married, but he tried to avoid her at all costs. So he enrolled at a university, a few hundred miles away from her, because she was moved into the family home. He wasn't there, so I'm going to uni, just to get away from her. But he said the dreaded part was coming home during the summer holidays and stuff, the Christmas breaks, because she, but obviously he would have to spend time with her, and she would force himself on him because the next logical step for her was like, I want sex with my husband and I want a baby, because her parents are saying, we haven't had a kid yet. So this is an example of, for me, of forced penetration, but in this instance by a woman.
Yeah. Wait. I'm confused. Let's dial back. Okay. We know that there is an element of SA there, as you just revealed.
Yeah.
But beforehand, were they being abusive? Like, was there abuse going on from the woman to the man in this scenario?
Not in this situation, but he was being abused emotionally and through blackmail to get married for the sake of his father's.
Yeah.
He experienced abuse. She wasn't abusing him in that relationship,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
the fact that they were married,
yeah,
she wanted the child.
yeah. And he didn't want.
He
Yeah,
did, yeah,
yeah.
she did sexual relations with him, but he didn't. He wasn't attracted to her, so she would force himself upon him to try and conceive. And people often have this kind of conception that, men just want sex all the time, and whoever is the woman, we know.
Sorry for rolling my eyes, but sorry.
Very clear example where my colleague here, my person who came to speak to me about it, he just wanted to avoid it at all costs. So he would say he couldn't wait to go back to university because he was staying up late
My God.
at night and often sleep on the sofa so that he wouldn't have to come to the bedroom with her. So this is the kind of example where he was trying to avoid having a relationship with her. It's a recipe for disaster when you force two people into it.
Specifically in the case of men, how is HBV recognized with domestic violence charities and legislation as well?
I'll say only in the last 20 odd years or so has there been a greater recognition of male victims of domestic abuse.
Yeah.
That has taken shape. But it's really over the last 5 years or so that male victims of domestic abuse, honor-based abuse, and forced marriages in particular, have taken shape and momentum because it's really, really under-researched and more victims are coming forward.
Mm-hmm.
But this is reflected in other areas. So male victims of modern-day slavery, male victims of modern-day trafficking, even sexual assaults and male rape as victims, is under-researched. It has a whole host of barriers. So as part of my research, I had to use the literature on male domestic abuse and male sexual assault and rape to kind of understand the barriers that might exist also for male victims of honor-based abuse and forced marriages. The very interesting thing about male victims of sexual assault and rape is that if the perpetrator is male, then it's kind of easier to get a conviction. Bearing in mind the conviction rates and the charge rates, that's another issue.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about it, theoretically.
Yeah.
Theoretically, it's a lot easier to convict a male perpetrator because the definition of the Sexual Offences Act requires a penetration with a penis, in the mouth, vagina, or anus. So obviously, if there's a male perpetrator, you can satisfy that criteria. But when you look at the male victims of forced penetration by women, they don't fit the definition because women don't have penises. So male victims cannot be the victims of by women because of the very definition. But isn't that, we know through case law, okay, in the UK, the case called R&R, the House of Lords in 1991 said marital can exist within a marriage. That a husband, even if they're separated, can unlawfully rape his wife and be convicted of it because marital rape is an offence within marriage. And yet, in this instance of the person, the male victim who was a victim of forced penetration by his wife, that wouldn't qualify as marital rape because of the definition of rape.
I need to really understand this. So, because it's codified as penetration and is defined as such,
yeah,
consent just goes out the window then?
It's a case of not fulfilling the criteria, what's known as the actus reus, which means the actions.
Okay.
So even at the first hurdle, the act wasn't committed because there's no penetration with the penis. And because of that, there can be no offence. It falls at the first hurdle. So don't even have to look at consent.
So they gotta look at, okay, penetration happened. That's fair. First hurdle. Then second, did you consent? If it was yes, okay, then case gone. You know what I mean? Yeah, exactly. Okay, from that lens, I can understand. I'm just...
But for the
that
woman,
is insane. I know, but I'm just saying that is... I understand.
The woman was the perpetrator, as it were.
Yeah.
even though there's no consent in the case of this rape kind of allegation,
Yeah.
she hasn't penetrated, in inverted commas, using a penis. And so she doesn't satisfy the definition under English criminal law. And again, that's a problem because, we've got other issues around school teachers, female school teachers having sex with school pupils, under the age of 16, etc. So they can't be guilty of either, even though there's no consent, because that kind of minor consent.
So to play devil's advocate again, let's just say that I'm yeah, like have to get a prosthetic, penis, give it to her and say, you know what, here, take it and put it in my in his, and that's how I can meet that criteria.
Because she hasn't used her penis, as it were.
That can't even work. Oh my god!
What she would be found guilty of if the other criteria was met would be sexual assault.
Oh my, yeah, okay. Which of course carries a lesser sentence, maybe even a slap in the wrist.
A man can be convicted of rape of a woman or a man.
Yeah.
A woman can't be convicted of a rape of a man. There's been some very good academics like Siobhan Weir. She's published some papers and some research on can men be victims of rape by women, and she looks at it from the moral, ethical, and human rights perspective. So she does look at the things like the absence of consent, and the act of penetration. What about when a woman places herself on top of a man? Isn't that an example of
penetrating their private space? Yes, of course.
Yeah, exactly. So, theoretically, morally, ethically, I think it does. But at the moment, society doesn't
recognize it.
Recognize that, and that goes and follows on from your earlier question about recognition of male victims. Male victims are under-recognized. There's, in general, it's changed over the 5 years, so we are building momentum. My activism, the activism of other people have are beginning to change that, but still society doesn't recognise male victims because men do not present as ideal victims. So many barriers. Same for sexual assault, modern day trafficking, etc. for male victims, domestic abuse, honour-based abuse, forced marriages, exactly the same. It's the idea of being disbelieved, ridiculed, issues about masculinity. If I come forward, am I being emasculated?
Yeah.
What makes it worse if I'm being forced or being domestically abused by women in a relationship? All these issues, lack of support, lack of funding, lack of male support organisations to actually support male victims. It's nowhere as near as mobilised and sophisticated as it is for women's female victims and violence against women and girls.
Yeah.
They're more mobilised. The provisions funding is available. It's not mobilised for male victims, and we have a very serious problem with that. Until that's rectified, until we also change the narrative and the social constructions of our ideas of who can be a male victim, then we're going to find it very difficult to encourage male victims to come forward. Is
this the result of the patriarchy? Let me just put that question forward first.
I suppose so, but this is an example of a law. If you can look at male victims by women, this is an example of a law designed primarily to protect women. So I fail to see how that's patriarchal, but I also accept that there are some patriarchal influences from an academic theoretical sense, in the sense that society has particular social constructions about how men should behave and who the ideal victim is. So the ideal victim in a rape case would be, a young white woman, single, vulnerable, etc. They are kind of usual silly kind of myths and stereotypes, and she might be raped by a stranger. Okay, those are myths. And you got victim blaming to add to that as well. That it's because she wore particular clothing or she was drunk, whatever. The kind of victim blaming that exists. Those are the kind of social constructions that exist within society. So I suppose, in one sense, the patriarchal influence on law has been designed in the sense that with the view and the idea that men can't be victims of rape because we're men, and men are strong, men are courageous, men are able to fight off their abusers. But when you're a young child, or as a male, and you're powerless, and your perpetrator is powerful, and they rape you, then obviously that can present as a male victim of male rape. But then when we get to other scenarios like female forced penetration upon a man, that can't be an example of male victimization because men want it. Men choose to have sex. In fact, men want sex all the time. And if they have a woman offering it, then they're really lucky. But you and I know that is not.
That is not the case. There are women that, like, try with you, and you're like, look, listen, I used to be a DJ. So I completely understand what goes on in the DJ booth. And I completely understand what happens when there's too much alcohol. But I do hate that trope that for some reason men are just always 24 hours, no lock and key down there, just just ready to go. But
but that's the kind of social construction, is that we're always up for it.
Yeah.
But the situations where you and I both feel, thank you, but no thank you.
Yeah.
And it's like, we also have feelings as well.
Yeah.
And we also have boundaries, for certain people. And we'll say, look, thank you very much. I am attracted to you, or thank you very much, no thanks. And yeah, if that was presented, I'm thinking about the police as well, because in the discussion of male victims of sexual abuse, domestic abuse, unabased abuse, forced marriage, whatever you're discussing, the police are a very male-occupied culture. The cultural occupation is very male-dominated. And so if you were to go to a police station as a male and say, I've been raped by a woman, and you're reporting it to a male officer, I bet you any money they'll be sniggering and laughing and joking. On that basis, it's like, why would male victims then go forward and report abuse?
Yeah.
It's not going to be believed. Are they going to be ridiculed?
Yeah.
Are they going to face discrimination? It's just bang out of order. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We're the 21st century now.
Yeah. Like,
I think we've made a lot of progress.
But there's still a long way to go.
Yeah. In changing our ideals and values and our morals and our ethics and our attitude towards male victims. But I think at societal level, it needs to change. It needs to change for a lot more. Some news yesterday. Sorry, I forgot names and stuff.
Yeah.
But there's a recent case of the male transsexual who was transferred to a women's prison.
Oh yeah. I think
He
I
was
heard of this.
convicted of 2 counts of rape, and now he's been moved to a men's prison.
Yeah.
And it kind of resonates, this idea, with me, because it just opens up the whole debate about, what do we do with issues about, transsexuals? Where do they go into prisons?
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in that area, so
Yeah,
I am going to
yeah.
even discuss that.
Yeah.
Someone quite rightly said, now that we're discussing this about, someone mentioned this on Twitter, by the way, which I read. Someone mentioned this is really, really interesting. They said, now that we're opening the debate about transsexuals and where they should go for prisons, there's obviously certain boundaries which won't be crossed by the legal system and the prison system. So where do we go about defining who can be a rape perpetrator? And I thought, and they said, do we need to degender rape? And so we open it up to, other categories, i.e. women who can be perpetrators as well. So I thought this is just amazing. And I thought, it's so loaded.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so interesting to discuss.
And it's non-discriminatory at the same time. Like,
exactly.
Yeah.
So what do we do now in terms of changing our rape laws when it comes to women as perpetrators? It's a really interesting topic. I'm not an expert on transsexuals, but it's just something that I identified and it resonated with me.
You wrote in a journal, I think co-authored article. I'm not sure what to call it, but it was an article abused by the patriarchy, male victims, masculinity, honor-based abuse, and forced marriages.
That's my own paper. Yeah, that.
Okay, but thanks for that. Thanks for clarification because you've done so much collaborative work that I like it's hard to keep track. How do walk us through that? How does the patriarchy contribute to honor-based violence and forced marriages and DV as well?
Yeah, so obviously at the moment we have a theory of violence against women and girls.
Yeah,
I think it's a plausible theory because it does exist, and at the moment statistics do show that women are predominantly the victims of domestic abuse, honor-based abuse, and forced marriages. As an academic who also researches men, I find it troublesome that people would like to cite those kinds of statistics when there's a clear absence of data collection on male victims. So I think we've gone along with the narrative that women are predominantly the victims, and to a certain degree, I will agree with that. But if there is no data collection available on male victims, in today's modern day society, don't you think we should temper our conclusions and say, well, it would be really interesting if the government and domestic abuse organizations also collect data on male victims?
Yeah.
Now, the forced marriage unit itself deals with forced marriage cases, and successfully except for the last 2 years, they've had about 600 cases, but that's only because they have a new method of recording and data collection analysis. In previous years, they have around about 1,200, 1,300, 1,400 cases each year of forced marriage, and 20 to 25% of those cases concern men. That is not a minority. That's a massive number.
Yeah.
And yet there's no other organisation in the UK that records that kind of data on male victims. So I am of the opinion, if there was proper data collection of male victims, whatever the issue is, if it's male rape, sexual assault, whether committed by a man or a woman, honor-based abuse, domestic abuse, forced marriages, I reckon the statistics would be a lot higher. And people would then be forced to say, yes, men can be also victims as well. And here are the legitimate government statistics on this. But unfortunately, there is a kind of fear on the part of some feminist organizations and academics to highlight this as a male victim issue because they fear that it would undermine their activism and their cause. And they hate the fact that people like myself also like to raise issues around female perpetrators, because that completely undermines the narrative that they have been discussing. Now, like I said to you before, I will work on female victims. I will work and provide all my efforts to highlight female victimization. But as a man, do not tell me and do not silence me to research male victims.
Outside of the statistics, etc., are there any solutions that you can offer from what you've seen from your research of violence against women and girls and violence against men and boys? Because I think you've got a very nuanced and a very balanced perspective researching both, and I think that is extremely valuable going forward, because I don't think any of us here are saying F the women, just look at us. Just look.
No, not at all. Like I said to you, I research both, and I think it's disingenuous for academics and commentators and activists to focus on one aspect of domestic abuse, honor-based abuse and forced marriages, and not recognize the other. If I'm truly going to be an academic, I need to recognize all possibilities. I need to teach my students all the facets, all the dimensions, all the characteristics, all the issues that are presented, because that is being loyal to the academy. And in my opinion, I don't see a problem in highlighting both, because it's presented as the same problem. So you mentioned the issue of patriarchy and how does it relate to, women and also men. And that's one example that I try to bridge a relationship between violence against women and girls and violence against women and boys. But then I go a step further. So I try to draw a similarity, then I highlight the difference. Please let me explain. So when you've got women being controlled and their sexuality being controlled, it's often the men who are doing it, like the fathers or the brothers and the uncles. And if that woman doesn't comply, then they might kill her in a so-called honor killing case.
Yeah.
That's an example of patriarchy controlling women and ultimately killing women. That's an example of men killing women. Okay, there's no dispute about that. That's very, very clear and understandable. But the patriarchy can also affect men. Like in that forced marriage example I gave early on in this interview, the pressure of the father to say, get married. Okay, the kind of pressure that exists, you're going to bring dishonor to the family if you don't get married. You're going to kill me. I'm going to die if you don't get married to the person who I say. So there is still that patriarchal influence, but there are other examples as well. So the patriarchy is very dominant. It's very controlling. It's also very heterosexual.
Mm.
And so if a male victim presents as bisexual or homosexual, then they're going against the cultural traditions of masculinity within a heterosexual society. And so then he may be a victim of honor-based abuse and forced marriage, or even conversion therapy, because the patriarchy says so. So in both honor-based abuse and forced marriages and domestic abuse, the perpetrators might very well be male, and the victims, very similarly, are both female and male. Why? Because like the feminist argument, the radical feminist argument in particular, there is a focus on the body, on both. Yeah? So the female body has to be virgin, pure, untouched. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And the male body, you can't be gay, you can't be bisexual. You have to do what we say and marry the person who we chose. It's a focus body on both.
Yeah.
So there's a theoretical link between violence against women and girls and violence against violence against men and boys under the umbrella of patriarchy. And that's what my paper was really trying to argue, because there was 29 case files and a significant proportion of those case files, 11 men experience honor-based abuse of forced marriages because of their sexuality. So the focus is on the body.
Yeah.
That said, there's also major differences for male victims of honor-based abuse, domestic abuse, and forced marriages, because parents, including mothers can be the instigators of violence and forced marriage as well. Because there are instances where the fathers are absent or have died.
Yeah.
So you got the mother, as the head matriarchy. She's calling the shots. Now, feminists would argue, she's been conditioned by the patriarchy.
Oh.
Okay, can you prove that?
Yeah, that sounds more like survival to me, if I'm being honest.
So you got these examples, and I think there needs to be a recognition that women can also be perpetrators. And now, with Professor Ben Hein and Dr. Ruth Bates, hopefully
doing amazing work.
We're hoping to work on Muslim male victims of domestic abuse by female perpetrators, i.e., wives and sisters. Just highlight female perpetration in the name of domestic abuse, forced marriage, and also honor-based abuse. Because when you've got abuse within a marital relationship where the man is a victim, you've got issues around about honor, shame, and masculinity, culture, and religion. And these are all going to be barriers for the man to come forward.
100%.
It's going to be, it's under-researched. There is no study on this whatsoever. So me, Liz, and Ben are going to be the first really to do this.
I'm so happy to hear that.
The issue about masculinity is that if then a male victim reports abuse, then he's being emasculated because he's presenting himself as being a victim, i.e. a woman. Okay?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And then if he goes to a police station to report an offence committed by a woman, or a man is somehow being disbelieved and ridiculed.
Yeah.
And so being a man reporting abuse, being a victim, actually contravenes what masculinity is about under social construction. Okay? So it's very hard for a man to come forward to say, I am a victim, whilst at the same time upholding masculine traits. In terms of a solution to this issue, we need more research on male victims to catch up with the research on violence against women and girls. And then what we need is to increase the level of support for male victims in comparison to, or in direct correlation to, the need or needs that men provide. Now, I'm not suggesting that we cut funding and resources for female victims in the violence against women sector. I'm not advocating for that at all, because we need to protect women. But at the moment, men are subsumed within violence against women and girls. So that to me is a contradiction. We should be considered separately, because I am not a woman. And I believe you don't identify as a woman either. Okay? So if we're victims, we want to be considered as male victims in our own right, not within a violence against women and girls strategy.
Yeah.
So the government needs to introduce a couple of things. I'm also the trustee of the Men and Boys Coalition, and we support a violence against men and boys strategy that identifies the particular needs, the particular barriers facing men and young boys, and also need a separate transformation fund for men, which funds domestic abuse, honor-based abuse, and forced marriage services. Related to that, we need also more domestic abuse organisations supporting men. I am of the opinion that if we were to encourage women's organisations to equally support men in the 21st century, I'd be very much in favour of that. And the reason why I say that is because I was also a trustee of the Elm Foundation for a couple of years. And they were primarily a women's organisation. If you look at the history, and I wrote about it in my book, from 1985, they were called North Derbyshire Women's Aid, something like that. Anyway.
Yeah.
And they transitioned and had a rebrand. They were called Derbyshire Domestic Violence and Sexual Abuse Service in 2010. And because of that change of name, men came forward to say, I'm a victim of sexual assault, I'm a victim of domestic abuse, I'm a victim of honor-based abuse and forced marriage. So because of the name change, women's organisation primarily began to get more referrals from men.
Is that why? Sorry, just quick sidebar. We'll go right back to that. Is that why the chapter of the book that you wrote was called "To the Transition from Women Only to Gender Neutral Domestic"?
Yes, exactly that.
Okay, yeah.
So it was in 2010 that they then piloted a study themselves that should we have a men's refuge, and should we provide men's support, male support for male victims? And there was actually resistance from some of the support workers and the board members. I mentioned this in the book chapter, but then they got the referrals in, and then they started to take the uptake of male victims, and gradually everybody came round. And it was a very good service. And then after a year or so, they said, we're going to continue this. So they've been doing this now for 12 years, 13 years, which is great. That's an example of how male victims and female victims can be simultaneously be supported, irrespective of gender. Now, they have separate refuges, but at the moment, the women's refuge at the Elm Foundation is much larger than the men's. I went to the male refuge. It's a house, 3-bedroom house only. It doesn't look inviting. There's only 3 single rooms for only 3 single men, and they can only support 3 men at a single time. And so more work needs to be done on that.
What?
Any referrals they get, they have to say no. So they've actually had referrals from London to North Derbyshire in the UK because there's no other refuge space.
I, this subject makes me very squirmy. So forgive me for being so animated because there's so many ways I'm trying to cope with this. Being victims of both genders, like growing up, it's insane that one is better looked after and I'm left out, so to speak. Because
that's how we feel as men.
yeah,
And I'm sorry. I don't apologise for my activism.
yeah.
I am going to raise my voice on behalf of the other male victims.
Thank you.
I'll always continue to raise the voice of women because you could say that's my first love, because that was my first exposure in terms of my history,
Yeah.
my research. You know, I developed studying violence against women and girls. So I will never stop that. And men's rights activists who have a go at me for focusing on violence against women and girls, I'll ignore them.
Yeah.
At the same time, I am going to fight for men's rights. Not as a men's rights activist
Yeah.
who, you know, completely ignores and hates women. No, not that at all. But I'm going to fight for men's rights and provide a voice for men.
I can't imagine myself in a scenario where I was still with my ex-wife and I'm getting abused and I have nowhere to run to. It's shocking to me. This is why I felt it was important to do this in the context of this docuseries, because taking away Depp, taking away Amber Heard, because we're not gonna talk about that. This is
Be here for another 5 hours.
This is the issue. This is the issue because I'm not here to demonize female victims because I've seen it.
Yeah,
I've seen it. I just didn't know it was this bad. I just didn't know it was this. You understand where I'm going from?
like bang my head against the wall. I've got nothing to play with. I'm going to have to start from scratch like my other academic colleagues. And we're going to have to dig out new information and new research. And there will be organisations out there, there will be activists and commentators out there raising an eyebrow, but I don't care because I want to reveal and research the truth, the reality, and give those who are silenced a voice.
The voice, yeah.
And then this is the thing that certain activists are scared about. Once we provide the evidence, it becomes legitimate. One other point, there's a Domestic Abuse Act of 2021. There's no mention of men in that. There's after a period of consultation about how to support, in general, female victims of domestic abuse. Forget minority women of domestic abuse. Nothing about honor-based abuse there.
Maz Idriss, I thank you so much for sitting down with me and re-traumatizing me for my life. Oh my Lord, I appreciate.
I have traumatized you.
No, you haven't.
And, you know, we matter. I'm sorry, but we matter.
Yeah.
We're just as important as women.
Yeah.
You know, but we don't have the same kind of resources or support or networks, and that's what we're trying to change.